Well, there's been a ton of talk about the UFC lawsuit with the fighters and that there was this settlement. But then there was this judge who decided, you know what? I'm not too sure about this settlement. We're going to talk about this. And so we wanted to know more about it. So we went to a guy that has been digging deep into it. John Nash used to write for Bloody Elbow. Now he's got his own podcast, the Just Not in the Face podcast. I love the name of it. Are you saying you don't like to get hit in the face? What a smart guy. But John, we want to tell you thanks so much for coming on here. Well, there's not a lot of clarity to this, and so if you can help the fans in breaking this down and giving them a perspective of why the judge would put a hiatus on it, why he would want to have more information, and what this means to both parties. There's a lot there to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, there's an absolute lot. So, starting almost 10 years ago, there was an antitrust lawsuit filed. It's known as the Lee v. et al. Lawsuit because Lee et al. V. Zuppa lawsuit, because Kung Lee was the first name of the named plaintiffs. There's 6 named plaintiffs. So that lawsuit winded its way through the courts, passed class certification, passed the appeal process, was set for trial, and then there was a settlement earlier this year. Everybody thought the settlement was in place. The 2 parties had agreed, and now there was a hearing 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago now, and the judge threw a monkey wrench in it by saying he has concerns about the settlement. And so there will be a hearing this Friday where the plaintiffs and the defendants, the plaintiffs being the fighters, the defendants being the UFC, will present their case to the judge and try to convince them to approve this settlement so that it can go forward.
All right, so let's get started from the beginning. So the beginning is this: the settlement was for $335, correct?
The beginning
for
$335 million.
Okay, and so now the judge is coming back and saying basically has concerns that it wasn't enough or it needs to be split up differently because you have the Cajun Johnson percentage of that, which I believe is what 30%, right? And then you've got the UFC. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, the original split was for the settlement was 75% for the Kung Lee class split, which covers anybody that fought in the UFC from December 16, 2010 to June 30th, 2017. And then the other class, the Cajun Johnson class, starts July 1st, 2017 until today. So that's the 2 classes. The Lee class originally got 75% of the settlement, and the Cajun Johnson class got 25%. Now they have a new proposal from just the other day, and their new proposal is 90% for the Lee class and 10% for the Cajun Johnson class. So a big difference. So yeah, that's the 2 splits. The judge's problem, as you said, is the amount, and he brought up is that you were asking, I certified, in other words, he granted class certification for a class action for a class that was asking for $811 million to $1.6 billion. This would be the Lee class. The Johnson class hasn't even done discovery, so they have gotten nowhere yet. So the Lee class, that huge amount of money, and so he's asking, if I grant you class certification for that, why is the settlement such a fraction of that amount? And so that's his concern. So he also kind of voiced some concerns that that there's kind of a divide between the 2 classes. The Lee class is basically going after money, and the Johnson class has something called injunctive relief involved, where they can ask for contract changes because they're considered current fighters, so they have standing to ask for contract changes.
But the Lee class got rid of injunctive relief, correct?
Well, they were kind of forced to because the judge said in the hearing, if you want to go for injunctive relief, he granted it to him, but then he said, if you want to go for injunctive relief, you got to go back through discovery with the Johnson class because we have to look at the contracts again. So it'd be another, probably 40 years to finish discovery, analysis, expert reports, hearings, and then go ahead with the lead trial with injunctive relief attached. And then as the attorneys for the plaintiffs brought up, the injunctive relief, doing the big change of the contracts that everybody wants, only the current fighters really can do that. So that would be the Johnson fighters. And there's a problem there because so many fighters in Johnson have signed class action waivers.
Yeah, and that's in the new contracts for the
classes.
That's in the new contracts for the UFC fighters that are signing right now, whether you're from the Dana White Contender Series, the Ultimate Fighter, or just a new fighter coming in from another promotion, or just basically just from a new fighter. You're signing
Yeah,
that you can never be involved in a class action lawsuit against them, correct?
Yeah, it's an arbitration agreement and class action. You can't go to trial with UFC. If you have a problem with your contract, you have to go to arbitration. You can't take part in a class action. But it's not just new guys. I mean, they had in the new filings, they reported that we know that over $1 billion has been earned by Johnson fighters from 2017 till April of last year. Well, according to the new filings, the people that didn't sign a waiver, their total earnings is about $143 million. And so in other words, the majority of the fighters have signed the waiver, and it sure seems like the ones that have signed the waiver are those that have the most fights and have earned by far the most money. And so that really hurts the plaintiffs for any future case, because you can try to take this Johnson case to trial, but as an attorney, it's like, what are we going to win? Because none of the fighters all the fighters under this class have signed waivers, so there's no damages that can be awarded to us. So we would spend tens of millions of dollars doing analysis and trying this case and potentially get no money back, which, attorneys, they're not doing this as charity. They're doing this as a business venture for them.
Is there a true breakdown when you talk about the Lee fighters and the Johnson fighters? And you're saying 90% now to Lee's group while 10% goes to Cage and Johnson's. When you look at this, is there a true breakdown of how many fighters are part of the class action suit under Johnson and how many fighters are under it with Kung Lee?
Yeah, under the Lee class, I think it's 1,214 fighters. I could be mistaken off a bit, but it's over 1,000. It's like 1,200 fighters.
Okay.
The Johnson class is a little bit more, but the problem is 55% have at least 55% of signed class action waivers. So that leaves about 500 or so fighters that don't have the waivers. And it looks like the fighters that didn't sign the waivers are those that fought mostly at the beginning of that class from like 2017 to 2021, and also the ones that didn't earn as much money. So that's the split right there. But every league, no one is excluded from the league class because none of them signed waivers, and even if they did sign waivers, none of those waivers apply to the league class. So that's the.
Go ahead, John.
One of the things that I was advised of, based upon the league group taking the offer by the UFC at $335 million, was that the time on the class action suit, it had been 10 years since that class action suit was first filed, and the 10 years was coming up that they were going to have to redo a lot of the discovery, a lot of the different interviews and things. It was all coming through that they were going to end up having to redo a bunch of the work that was already done based upon the amount of time. Is that true?
Well, no, that wouldn't be true. It wouldn't. You wouldn't. Okay. After 10 years, you don't have to redo it. The problem was, if they wanted to go after injunctive relief, they would have to redo all that work they did on discovery, getting evidence of the UFC, looking at contracts, doing the people they pay to do these regression models cost thousands of dollars per hour. And we are talking millions of dollars you pay these experts to do analysis and regression models. So they'd have to do all that again. So in their opinion, I mean, I can understand plus you got to remember, these attorneys have done tens of thousands of hours with no charge. They don't get paid until the fighters get paid. And so they are sitting, having done they calculate tens of thousands of hours of free labor without and have paid millions of dollars out of their own pocket for the experts. The attorneys pay for that. And then they'd be looking at potentially tens of millions of more dollars to go into discovery that might not add anything, but might not help them that much.
But the original purpose of going in with this was to change the contract so fighters would be able to have freedom to do something outside. And when they gave away the injunctive relief, why did they do that, knowing that their ultimate goal was to change the contracts and the structure of how the UFC does business?
Well, it kind of got taken out of their hands. That was the original goal. Was we were going to file a lawsuit against the UFC. We were going to win damages for the fighters that were underpaid. We're going to force the UFC to change their contracts, or we also just keep suing them if they don't do it. Every 5 years, we file another lawsuit, and a whole group of new fighters get paid. That was the original concept. The problem is the case took so long and got held up that there was a group of fighters that started showing up, that would have started showing up, that would not be covered by the lawsuit, because their discovery ended on June 30th, 2017. So when we get to July 1st, 2021, every fighter that fought after that, the statute of limitations would have passed. So that they filed a new complaint to cover these fighters so that they would also be covered. But the problem is that created a split in the class. So now there's a second class that the injunctive relief would go to over the lease. That's one. The other problem is the Supreme Court made some series of just awful rulings, basically saying that you can force people to sign arbitration agreements and class action waivers. So in some ways, like if you're accusing a company of having monopoly power and abusing their monopoly power, but they can force you to use that monopoly power to force you to sign contracts saying, I can't sue you for using that monopoly power. And that's what happened. The Supreme Court did a series of rulings, and because they found that constitutional, starting in 2000, well, over a stretch, but 2019 was the big year, 2018 with Epic Systems, that the UFC, seeing that and saw that there's a new class, now started forcing all the fighters to sign this class action waiver. And as soon as they did that, it changed the nature of the lawsuit, because no longer could Lee go after injunctive relief and change the sport. But even that, there's no possibility of really future lawsuits. The UFC is immune to them because every fighter now has to sign a class action waiver. So they don't have to worry. This original plan has been completely thrown out and derailed because the UFC forced fighters to sign class action waivers.
So when they get rid of the injunctive relief, though, then the next thing only available to do is grab for money. And then that was the next question. There were so many arguments, like, why would you settle for such little money at $335 million, knowing that you have 1,200 fighters, which I believe, 200 or 300 of them are not going to be eligible because they're in the UK or Ireland or Brazil and Japan, whatever it is.
Well, that might be different, actually, because the lead attorney did say that they're going to consider that if your fight was broadcast in the US, they'll view that as having fought in the US. So every fighter, even the international fighters, will be included in that league class.
Okay. But knowing that, look, so then what, go back to the settlement of $335 million for 1,200 fighters. That is, I mean, I don't want to say it's pennies, but it's not, knowing that you could have, and for the longest time, and you and I talked about this on the phone the other day, and I said, I expected this thing. That's why I didn't really follow it along that much until just recently. I expected this thing to go another 3 or 4 more years and struggling to get through and get that number up to above 500 to 700 million, somewhere around that line. That's when I thought they would get closer to a settlement to the UFC. What's your, why do you think they settled at the 335?
Well, because there's several issues. One, when you go to a federal class action antitrust case, a federal case like this, you have a jury from anywhere from 6 to 12 jurors. This case, you're going to have 8 jurors. All 8 jurors have to rule unanimously in your favor. So if one juror doesn't agree with your case, you basically lost because you didn't get unanimous. So the judge can't award you the case. So that's one issue. It's risky. It's very risky on the plaintiff's part to go to trial because you could possibly lose. The advantage they have that forces settlement is they have massive amount of damages they can bring to you, and they have injunctive relief, which scares the defendant into settling because they're like, if we lose, it's a massive change to our business. But when you take injunctive relief away and you say you can no longer go for injunctive relief because of the class action waivers and because of the splitting of the class, well, now all you have is damages. That's much less threatening to the UFC. Because for one, even if you win and they treble it, you have to go through the appeal process, and you have to worry that this case will go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is a very conservative federalist court. They do not side with labor much. They're not a pro-labor court. And so you have to worry that in the appeal process that this could be overturned. And so you're always, you got to weigh the odds. Now, it's possible. Perhaps they should go for it. Perhaps they should accept the judge's request and go to trial and roll the dice. But I think they did weigh and say, we do not have the threat to the UFC of changing their business model to get them to agree to our terms. And there's a serious risk that we could not get all 8 jurors to agree with us. So we have to take amount of money that we think is acceptable.
Though,
that's a strong possibility.
Majority of the time in these class action lawsuits, they'll run let's just say the UFC, and then also to the fighters' lawyers, they're going to run mock juries to make sure and see exactly. They're going to run it multiple times and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make sure that this thing is run on point. So multiple times, I would imagine they ran them and found that one or two jurors always came up on the other side.
Oh, in fact, that's supposedly what happened. There's Zach Arnold reported, and I've heard from other people that there's a group of people, a demographic, that always votes against the fighters. That that there's a group of people for whatever reason. There are those, you see them on Twitter. You signed the contract, no matter whatever condition they made you sign the contract. Never mind if you had no option, but you had to sign the contract. You signed the contract, you got to live with it. There's a group of people that strongly hold that view, and if they're the people that show up, even if there's only a 1 in 10 chance that a juror could be one of those people, well, there's 8 chances they'll be one of those guys. 1 in 10 for 8 people. That means your chances of winning are probably about 20%. And so that's the problem.
Last thing you want to do is go to a jury trial.
Yes.
No one wants to go to a jury trial.
Theoretically, juror trials usually are in your favor when you're the little guy versus big business. But it seems with athletes, it might be a little different. That the public might not be as sympathetic to athletes. It's hard to get them sympathetic when I can see you can win support because fighters don't make a lot. This is not like NFL, NBA players making tens of millions. A lot of fighters don't make a lot. But again, you get in that thing where you sign the contract. So it's not like a league sport where you can point to collusion and say, look how the owners are behind the scenes plotting against us. The UFC is one entity, so there is no collusion. You can't point to that obvious conspiracy against you. You can only point to the fact that they set up a climate that gave you little option to sign a contract that might not have been favorable.
BetUS, America's favorite sports book, where you can bet on everything anytime. Sportsbook, live betting, and casino. To celebrate 30 years in business, we have the best bonuses in the industry. Get a 125% sign-up bonus and up to 30 risk-free bets. So what are you waiting for? Join now. BetUS, where the game begins.
I think when you start putting the word pro athlete in front of anything, the casual person at home is like, oh, they make millions. They're on TV. I mean, the common misconception is that when people see me out in public, or just not me or anybody that's been on TV, they're like, oh, you're rich. And that's what you're going to get in terms of jurors that come in there. They're going to automatically believe that you made all this money, even if it's right in front of them. This person made $100,000. This person made $400,000, but they've taken a lot of damage to their brain and their body that they're going to later on have issues with. Now, they also signed that contract and know that. But in terms of a pro athlete and a pro sport that is making billions of dollars, this is a drop in the bucket, I guess you could say, for this league.
Yeah, I thought that would be to the fighter's benefit, because you could put on the stand a fighter that made, 30, 40 after. Remember, this is your earnings, as you know very well, is gross. It's not net. There's expenses. So you could point to a fighter that made $50,000 a fight and then explain, really, he walked home with $25,000 to $30,000 a fight. So he's making middle class wages, but now he's got a neck that won't churn. He's got CTE. He could explain all the problems. I need a hip replacement. That would be very sympathetic. But then you get in that group of people that you signed the contract. It doesn't matter that you could theoretically argue that the UFC took away the competition or the possibility that the competition could compete on a level playing field, so the wages could go up. You could explain that as much as you want. In their head, you signed the contract, that's it. So if that's true, I'm not in the mock jurors, but that's what I heard, something very similar to that. That would explain why they were hesitant about going to trial, especially they no longer had injunctive relief. If you can't threaten the UFC with, we're going to just completely destroy your business model, it then gets harder, because the UFC we will roll the dice to go into trial with you.
Yeah, when making this decision, though, when they said, okay, look, I want to have a judge decide the fate, or I want to have a jury, why did they go with the jury? Did they, like you were just saying, they felt like they were going to be more sympathetic to, hey, we didn't make a lot of money?
Yeah, in the hindsight, that was probably a mistake, because they didn't know they're going to get this judge who seems very sympathetic to their, if you read his class certification, he basically spells out a case that basically, in his findings, is the UFC has monopoly power and has abused it. And he goes through just a long list of reasons, and cites, expert reports and cites precedent. He would have been great to be, if you're the plaintiffs, you would have wanted him as do the bench trial with him. But because, generally the public jurors side with the low guy versus the big, I think they thought it was worth it to go with the jury trial, because it would make the UFC nervous, because again, you put some poor fighter on one side that's physically ill, and on the other side you put the guys that walked away with billions of dollars.
So with what the judge has done in making this not occur under the certain circumstances, the current circumstances, what are the options that you see that the judge has? I mean, obviously he can sit there and say, okay, I'm going to let it go through. Or what is the other side of what he can do here?
Well, the first one, he could let it go through. They're gonna make their pitch, try to convince him to accept the new settlement. He could,
and that's going to be both sides, isn't it?
Yeah, both sides want it to pass. Both sides want the settlement. Now he could turn it down and say, come back with something better, right? He can't tell them what to do, but he can just say, I'm not going to approve this. So if he does it, the two sides could get together and try to come up with something better. Maybe the UFC says we're going to up for the Lee class, we will up the amount of money a little bit, and for the Johnson class, we will improve the contractual changes that we included in the settlement. And then they go back and maybe approves it. And if he doesn't accept that, then it goes to trial. Or if the UFC feels that the judge wants too much or the plaintiffs want too much, they might say, you know what, we are not going to agree to the settlement any longer. Let's go to trial. So all that's on the table right now. If I had to bet, I would bet that the judge, I bet the judge does approve the current settlement. I would lay odds on that. But I do think there's a strong chance that any of the other possibilities happen.
Okay, so let's say the judge approves it. Now, you and I were talking on the phone the other day. We're talking about actually, like, a lot of these fighters have no idea. And the reason why I know they have no idea, because as of recently, I've been kind of doing a little bit more research on it and then also talking to you. And I know that they have spent no amount of time figuring it out. Give these athletes and these fighters the understanding of the breakdown. Sure, it's going to be 90 if it does get approved, 90-10, but give them how they would figure out what they would potentially be making then. Yeah.
First, let me just point out, if you're a fighter, I really recommend you go to the website, because they set up a website for fighters in this, UFCfighterclassaction.com. Just go in on the second tab over. It's not the contact information, but keep in touch or something. They'll ask you to put your information, your email, and that way they will email you or call you directly or whatever, send you messages directly about updates. Because if it does get settled, if we do get approved, you want to be able, because eventually what's going to happen is they're going to send you a settlement form saying this is what you earned, this is what you're going to get, you're going to approve it, sign it, and then they'll either wire you or mail you a check. So they'll have, I think, like a year to do that, so a certain amount of time. I don't think they've set the amount of time yet, but there's a chance some fighters might, out of the loop, might miss that. So I want every fighter, because you deserve the damn money, get your money, go in there and put your name to make sure you stay in the loop and get contacted about that. Now, for the first,
before you go any farther,
before you go any
farther, I just want to know, out of those 1,200 and whatever amount for that Lee section, what if they don't? What if they're one of those 1,200 fighters and they don't do this? What's going to happen?
If they don't do it, the money, if it's a tiny, tiny amount of money that's left over at the end, it goes to charity. There's a charity already set up. I can't remember what it's going to be. But if there's a sizable amount, enough that they can split and it's cost effective, it'll be split amongst the remaining fighters. So if you want to be an evil guy, just call all the other fighters and tell them not to do this, because you're just, like, listen, it's a scam. Don't put your name down, and then watch your income just skyrocket as everybody is left out of the pool.
Well, you're killing it right now for me. You're just killing it right now.
Yeah. So the original plan would have worked, but every fighter should put their name down on that. The first class is the Lee class, and that covers, if you fight, as I said before, if you fought in the UFC from December 16, 2010 until June 30, 2017, you will get 90%, your tranche, as they call it, will be 90%. So right now they estimate, now you got to take out the attorney fees. The attorneys are asking a third.
33 and a half?
Yeah, they're asking for a third of the total amount. Doesn't mean they'll get it, because if the judge isn't happy with the settlement, the judge has to prove that. He could end up lowering their settlement, how much goes to the attorneys, and right now that seems possible because he doesn't seem to like the amount. But for right now, we'll use the amount based on if the attorneys got their full fee. $215 million would go to the fighters. 90% of that goes to the Lee class. I did the calculation. The way you calculate how much you would get as a member of that group is you take your total earnings during the period that you fought from December 16, 2010 to June 30, 2017, multiply it by 24%, and then add another almost $11,000, $10,800 or whatever per fight that you had during that period. So if you bought 10 times and made $500,000 to make an easy amount, you would get $120,000 in the total bout amount. And then for the number of fights, the 10 fights, you'd make another $100,000 and $108,000. So together, that's $228,000 would be your amount. So a little over 40% of what you earned during the UFC career.
Got it.
During that period. That's the Lee class. For the second class, the Johnson class, from June 1st, July 1st, 2017 until now, until this settlement gets approved, you would get a much lower percentage because they get much lower. Supposedly, only like 12% of the total income earned by fighters during that period is not covered by class action waivers. So if you did not sign a waiver, and you might not know you did, because apparently a lot of people don't know they signed waivers. I don't think they're just in contracts. I think they're snuck into bout agreements. They were snuck into broadcast agreements, just various different agreements. So the vast majority of high earning fighters apparently signed this. But if you didn't sign it, you get about 10% of the amount of money you earn during the Johnson period from July 1st to now. And if you did sign the waiver, you're only going to get $3,000 because technically you're not part of the class action. So they're going to give you $3,000. So, which is terrible because you could be someone. I mean, I don't know if Adesanya signed it or someone, but someone like the top guys. I have a theory that Conor McGregor signed it because otherwise I can't believe there'd only be 143 million left. So you'd imagine. So if Conor McGregor signed this, here's the guy that went from maybe making $80 million in 4 fights. He's going to get $3,000 in return for his period, for the Johnson period, which is just it blows my mind considering that if that's possibly true. So anyways, but yeah, so if you signed it, you're unfortunately going to get $3,000. But if you're in the Lee period, you get your full Lee amount. And if you're in Johnson, you sign the waiver, you will get $3,000 for that. So they go together. So you don't get one or the other. You get both if you're in both periods.
But Conor and Khabib would come in the Lee class because Conor didn't come in until 2015.
Conor would be in both classes. So if he in the Lee,
and that's why I'm saying he'd be in both. And so what does that mean?
Well, in the Lee class, we can calculate because we know what Conor made during his UFC run up until 2017. We know he made $27 million because the lawsuit reported that. So he would get about a little over $7 million for the Lee class. For the Johnson class, it all depends on how much he earned and did he sign that waiver or not. If he signed that waiver, if he didn't sign the waiver, he's probably getting around $7, $8, $9 million. If he did sign the waiver, he's getting $3,000 for the Johnson period.
I just want to point this out is that I know on my last fight with Tony Ferguson, I think in 2014, it was 2014, 2015, I can't remember. There was several documents that were put in front of me without my agent, my managers, or anyone there. And they normally did it when the Reebok deal came in. They're like, hey, you have to sign this, you have to sign this. And they would put it right in front of you when you picked up your packages. Those are things that I was very aware of them trying to do things like that. And so I never, ever signed anything during that time. And you would often get threat tactics like by people that worked for the UFC. They were there saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to call Dana. And I'm obviously at that point in my career, I'm like, look, I've been doing this for 20 years. You can call whoever you want. It's not going to make me sign that. But if you are a younger fighter in that position, that's a very scary situation because your dream is to fight in the biggest organization in the world. And the first thing you're going to do is sign whatever they tell you to.
My farm needs the earth, the air, and the water. I get my energy going on LMNT Electrolyte Drink Mix. Clean, good-tasting energy that feeds me like I feed my plants and animals. And after a long day on the tractor, when it's time to shoot the podcast, I drink LMNT so that I can stay energized and stay salty. Let's get it on.
And you don't know also what your financial situation is. There were some stories, I reported on it, when the COVID epidemic hit and the first events in Jacksonville and stuff were happening, they would put addendums in the contracts when you'd show up and sign them and say, you waive everything. You're basically waiving all rights for this event. And, you had no choice because if you didn't sign it, you're not fighting. And I do not know the financial situation of a lot of the fighters at the time. I mean, it's possible that you spent all your money on your camp, you showed up to fight, and you're ready to fight, and your fight could be canceled and not get paid. And the famous one is Nate Diaz as well, who every time they would give him a Chimaev fight, he could finish his contract. And if he didn't take it, they would give him another fighter with an addendum, adding 3 fights to his deal. So that was his choice. You either fight Chimaev to get out, or you fight Dustin or Tony. And he was fortunate enough that at the very end, Chimaev missed weight.
By a lot.
Yeah, that's not it.
Yeah.
I mean, John, you have any other questions?
No, you've answered a lot for me. My one question for it is this: the judge sitting on this, and if there's one thing that's happened, and look, the UFC has always done all of their lawsuits in the Las Vegas area. They've done very well with everything there. This one judge has tended to, he doesn't care. He doesn't, he's not he's following like, oh, you're one of ours or anything like that. He's been very good with this entire process. What is it in the end that you think the judge is looking for, and why? You think he's just saying, I just want this to be fair?
Well, I think part of
it he's looking for the UFC to have to pay.
I think part of it, he's been convinced by the case. You read that class cert, and it seems it's very much likely that he is convinced that he thinks the UFC abused their power, that he granted class cert. And because, remember, this is a class action. So even though there's named plaintiffs, the judge is there to represent all the fighters. So he has to step in and say, yes, they've approved this, but I think on behalf of the fighters, this might not be the best settlement. There will be a chance going forward. Now, even if it gets approved, the fighters will have a chance to do 2 things going forward. One is they'll have a chance to speak up and say if they agree or disagree with the settlement. And the judge could change his mind at that point if a lot of fighters show up. They could also, I suggest fighters, one thing I would love to see happen is some fighters show up and basically ask, why were the contract changes that the UFC put in their contracts from 2017 to 2020, the ones that let Francis Ngannou out of his contract, the ones that prevented them from continually extending contracts for turning down fights, why did they get rid of those provisions, and why aren't they included in the settlement? Because those provisions would be very beneficial to fighters. And if the UFC, if they were able to operate from 2017 to 2020 with those, why do they have to be excluded now? So I would like to see at least that happen. The other thing is some fighters with arbitration agreements might want to think about what's called opting out. The problem with opting out is you'd have to go to arbitration because you signed an arbitration agreement, and you would have to finance finance your trial, your hearing, whatever yourself. So you'd have to hire financial experts that are very expensive. So most fighters probably couldn't do that. But some of the top fighters could probably pay out the couple $100,000 it might cost to get financial experts. It's a big risk, but they possibly could be looking at additionally millions of dollars instead of $3,000. So for them, for a select few group of fighters, it might be worth, if this gets settled, to think about opting out.
So if this thing does get approved, I mean, what is the time frame in which we're looking like for payouts for these fighters?
Well, it would be within a year if it got approved. There would be a period of time. There's several days events that have to happen afterwards. There'd be a chance for fighters to come and do the hearing and say their opinion. So if fighters don't like they do not like the settlement, and I should note, I did a survey of a bunch of fighters, and it is kind of mixed. The majority want the settlement now because they kind of need the money and they don't want to take the risk. But there's a sizable amount that think the fighters should continue fighting and try to change the sport. So if fighters don't like it, they'll have a chance to hear, and then there'll be the plaintiffs will present their plan of distributing the money. Then the plaintiffs will send out notices to all the fighters. After that, sometime and probably within 6 months or so, it'll take a while. They'll contact all the fighters. You'll have to, like I said, reply with your information, approve the information they give you, and then a wire or a check will go out to you. But it will not be, if this gets settled, if they get the process done, it will be done, I would say, by early next year.
No, I just want to go ahead.
My last question is this, John, in your opinion, what's best to happen for the fighters, and then what's best to happen for the sport?
Well, I mean, for the fighters would be to get a lot of money. I think would be the best for the fighters, because a lot of fighters would need the money, especially the ones at the bottom. So it's I think what's best for the fighters in the sport don't have to be mutually exclusive. I would like to see, I mean, I don't want to see like the whole sport turned upside down and stuff, but to me, it's a very simple process. The fighters, if you give the fighters more freedom, I mean, the UFC is an 800-pound gorilla. No one's going to be pushing them off their perch. No one's going to, but there should be no reason why if you have this much power and control of the sport, I don't understand why your contracts have to be so exclusive and coercive, right? So you control your own titles, okay, let's let you control your own titles. But as we see in boxing, controlling the titles, if we know through the history of boxing, lets you monopolize and dictate the fighters' terms because you want to be a champion, and the champions are the most valuable people. So if we want to let the UFC hold their belts, I don't understand why we can't let the contracts be much more flexible, much less restrictive, shorter duration, no tolling provisions, stuff like that. UFC, they can still be the number one promotion. That won't kill the UFC. They would just have to spend more to retain that position. Right now, they don't even have to choose to spend more because they can get the fighters to sign with them dirt cheap, and they're locked into the UFC.
Well, they didn't become the 800-pound gorilla though by doing their contracts that way. That's why they're holding on to this little bit.
That's the exact, exactly.
But that's one.
I mean, that's why we had an antitrust trial.
But that's one thing. But then on top of that, though, the reason being is because they've seen how boxing has really kind of fallen off. There's really no organization. They're all just trying to hold their fighters hostage by whether it's a title, whether it's not. There's a lot more politics involved in that than there is in the UFC. And so I think when they see boxing, they have one good fight or two good fights a year, whereas the UFC is delivering multiple top-level fights across the board. Other promotions cannot compete with that right now, and they don't want anyone to compete with that.
I really have to disagree with that. As a boxing fan, the last year has been amazing. I mean, every month we're getting 2, 3, 4 just massive fights. As a boxing fan, you find the difference is boxing is built around the main event and the fighter. Yes. I mean, one thing you can't have, UFC fights end quick. So you can't have 12. You die. I mean, the Saudis have tried to put 9, 10 boxing matches on. You're falling asleep. You cannot do that same thing in boxing because the fights, they last longer. But I do think boxing, the problems with boxing, and I'm not saying there's not. We know there's problems with boxing. That's why we have federal regulation. But in some ways, their problems are intentional. The Ali Act and they have their own antitrust problem in the 1950s with the IBC of New York case, which if you go read it is very similar to the UFC case. They had their Ali Act, and if you listen to the hearings, they explain stuff that sounds very similar to what the MMA is happening in MMA and the UFC. So boxing has had their problems, and in some ways they put up these regulations that make it a mess because it prevents concentration. It lets more competition between, we have multiple promoters working in boxing. We might dislike it. We have multiple sanctioning titles operating. So there's boxers have tons of options, and they can use that to drive up their wages as high as possible to almost absurd levels, for some people's point of view. But they have that. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think boxing is a problem, but I do think boxing could maybe listen to some of the hearings and clean up a little bit. But I do think MMA could look at it too and say, there are certain things we're doing that follow the path of what got boxing regulated. Maybe we should try to tinker with that so we don't end up in the situation, which we seem to have ended up in, where one promoter is making 90% of the revenue and giving the fighters less than 20% of that revenue.
Yeah. I've always thought that the percentage should have been a little bit higher, but I also said baby steps. Like what now I think they're at 17-something% correct of what they're getting. The UFC fighters or MMA fighters are getting 17% of the UFC.
They might even be higher than that. We think that they might even be up to 19%. And possibly because of the antitrust lawsuit, that might be part of the reason because they changed their contracts. Now, going forward, they don't have to do that, so it might go back the other direction. But it did go up a little bit. But I think for me, it's just a simple thing. I am paying to watch people potentially inflict bodily, life-altering bodily harm on each other. I would like to see the people I'm paying to watch do that get the vast majority of the money I'm paying. And to me, that's the simple thing I would like to see.
Okay, so last thing for me, though, I just wanted to give this one last breakdown. Is it basically you're summing up all the money that each fighter has made. So one fighter, if they want to know what they're making, they sum up everything they've made in that contract. So say you make $100,000 plus, I know you and I talked about this, was it's also the backroom bonuses, also the fight bonuses that you get for fight of the night, performance of the night, all that, everything together is accumulated, not just your fight.
Everything's bout related. So it's not the Reebok kit. It's not sponsorship. It's not royalties, but it's your show. It's your win. It's any side letters. If you have a side letter agreement, it's your pay-per-view bonus. If you have that, it's fight of the night bonuses. It's your locker room bonuses or any discretionary bonuses they would have gave you. All those are included and during the period of each class. So from 2010 to June 30, 2017 for Lee. Add that together, take 24% of it. This is the current formula. Now it could change. It could also go up if some fighters don't collect, or if some of the money from Johnson gets moved over, or if the lawyers don't get as big as fees. So 24% you get of your total earnings, and then you add about $10,800 per fight you had during that period. Okay, and that's for the league class.
And now to make sure that these fighters get this money, to make sure it doesn't get left there after a year, what's the name of the website? And also, how do they input their information for that?
Yeah, there's a website that the plaintiffs have set up called UFC Fighters ClassAction.com. You go into it, the second tab over, I can't remember exactly what it says. It says like stay informed, I believe it is. You click that, it asks for your name, information, email, number. You fill that out, and then they will start contacting you and sending you updates. And the website also includes documents of several of the filings, where we're at right now, other information like that, how to get a hold of them. But you fill that out, and I should stress too, because apparently some fighters that weren't in the class have opted out. One of them opted out. Funny enough, he was fought before the class period. And the only fighter that opted out wasn't even a member of the class. But if you're from December 16, 2010 till June 30, 2017, you're in the league class. And if you fought from July 1st, 2017 till now, you're in the Johnson. You can be in both classes. It's just they calculate your settlement differently. So, and I should also stress again, this is just the proposal. It isn't official, but I think it's very important, because I would hate for fighters not to get their money, because some of these guys really need it, to not put your name in there and get your information. So when it does get finally approved, you'll get that money.
And then lastly, make sure you guys are paying attention to your email and letters in the mail if any of this stuff comes to you, because I know that a lot of fighters, a lot of people that I know just throw stuff away, or they just put their email to junk. Let me throw it to junk. Let me just trash it, whatever it is. Make sure you guys are opening it and reading it.
Yeah. And also make sure that your manager is not taking 20% of that, or 15 or 20. And hopefully you didn't sign a contract with some attorney or manager that says they get a piece of that. So I should warn too, some fighters are probably getting contacted from lawyers and managers claiming that they need to work through them to get their money. You do not. It's yours. Do not fall for anybody that's asking you to sign something with them to get it.
Did you hear that, guys? Ladies and gentlemen, if you heard that, make sure your manager is not, get your agent, your manager, your publicist, whatever, is not getting any of this money. You got to learn to stick up for yourselves against your managers and agents. These are people that you've been closest with. Of course, they've put in the work to train you, but this is something completely different. And if your manager was doing a good job, then you probably have plenty of money already by now. So, but this is one of those situations that you definitely don't need them to finish and get your check. So keep an eye out for all that. Go to the website and fill out the paperwork or fill out the information so you can be contacted and make sure you get part of this settlement. Is there anything else, John Nash?
No, that covers, I guess, if you follow me on Twitter or if you follow my podcast, we always update this case. So
give us the podcast again one more time.
Well, I didn't want to correct John there. He said it wrong, but it's Hey Not the Face podcast. The Hey Not the Face podcast.
I apologize.
Yes,
no hitting the moneymaker, baby. No hitting the moneymaker.
Yeah. If you remember Blazing Saddles, Hey Not the Face. So.
Well, thank you so much for all of the information. It's awesome that you put it out there, so some of these fighters are going to have a little bit of an idea of what they're looking towards. And I want to tell you, thank you so much for keeping up on the case. And please, if something changes, we want to have you back on so you can tell everybody what it is. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me on, guys.